Hello, this is Mike Smith. Welcome back to another Maya tutorial. This time we're going to have a look at creating and applying an ambient occlusion material to produce a render looking like this. You can see with an ambient occlusion you've got a nice contrast from some pure whites down to pure black, and that really makes some of the details stand out. It's particularly good if your modelling is quite accurate. So in this example, it's a gearbox I made for a car quite a while ago, but I put a lot of detail in this and it took me quite a long time to make. And if you really want to show off your model for a portfolio or a showreel, an ambient occlusion render is ideal. You need to make sure you're confident with your modelling skills though, as any imperfections will stand out quite badly. So one more thing with an ambient occlusion render is you don't need any lighting. This particular render just has a floor and obviously the object just above the floor, and all the contrast is automatic. So let's take a look at applying that. Now you can see inside Maya here, this is a render just using the default Lambert material, that's Lambert 1, and you can see it looks quite dull, it's boring, there's no real contrast there. So we'll add the ambient occlusion material. So to begin with, make sure as always your project folder is set up, your scene is saved, and we need our outliner open, and we need our attribute editor open, ready to use. So to actually create the ambient occlusion material, we need to go to Window, Rendering Editors, and then Hypershade. And if you haven't seen your Hypershade before, or if you're not too sure about what you can do with it, basically you can find and access all of your different materials, and at the top here we can see all the materials that are in our scene. So at the moment this is a relatively new scene. There's no materials in there other than the default ones. So we can see we've got Lambert 1 right there. And below this we have our work area. Your work area allows you to move around and navigate through different materials, link them together if you need to, and you can really create a custom material, and that's what we're going to do now. So make sure your Mental Ray plugin is activated. If it's not, you'll need to revisit some of my older tutorials to see how to do that. So once that's done, in your Hypershade window, if you take a look at this list of information on the left hand side, we need to make sure we can see Mental Ray there. And if we go ahead and click on Surface Shader, that gives you a surface shader here. That's just a basic material that doesn't really have any look or feel about it, but we can add some connections to this, and you'll see that not only appears in our work area, but it also appears at the top. So while we've got this one selected, just click on that to select it. If we have a look in our attribute editor, you have some basic information here and you can make some adjustments, but for now we'll leave this on the default value. All we want to do is give this surface shader a title. So I'm going to call this one AO1 for Ambient Occlusion 1, just so I know what it is. And you can see that it's changed the name here in the Hypershade too. Now we need to go back onto your Hypershade window, and on the left hand side click on Textures, and then in here we get a whole other list of different materials, and you'll see if you read down through some of these, there's two different types of occlusion. You've got the ambient occlusion, and then you have a fast occlusion. We need to make sure we click on ambient occlusion. So once you've gone ahead and clicked on that, you'll now see it just looks pure white. That's fine at the moment, and we need to move this up to one side of our surface shader. Make sure you give yourself a gap, don't have it right up against it. That's because we need to create a connection. And to do that, whether you're on a Mac or a PC, hold Control on your keyboard, middle click the mouse, and then we can drag from the ambient occlusion onto the surface shader. And that creates an input connection here into the surface shader. So now if I select my surface shader again, you'll see in your attribute editor, you've got your surface shader tab called AO1, and you have another tab here, which is actually your occlusion, your ambient occlusion tab. And that's where we're going to make some adjustments. Really, we only need to adjust one particular attribute, and that's the samples, which at the moment is 16. Now we'll leave it at 16 for now, just so you can see what it looks like at its default value. And now we need to actually apply this to our objects in our scene. And to do that, we need to select everything in our scene, including the floor. I'll do that through the outliner. You can see I've got my gearbox grouped, and then I'm going to hold Shift and select the floor as well. And then in my hypershade window, I'll right click on my surface shader and then go to Assign Material to Selection. And when we do that, don't be alarmed that everything goes black in your scene. That's not a problem. Now we can go, and I'll minimize the hypershade window for now, just in case I need it again. Now if we render this as it is, if I click on the Render Current Frame button, it might take some time depending on what machine you're on. And we can see here, now that's rendered, we've got the contrast, but it does look quite grainy. And with that, we can't quite see a lot of the detail. It doesn't look that sharp. But at least we've got the contrast from pure white. We've got some blacks in there as well, and we've got a nice shadow on the bottom. So if we increase the sample rate of our ambient occlusion material, you'll get a much smoother looking surface on all of these. You won't get as much grain. The only downside is it will dramatically increase your render time. So I'll still leave my render settings at their default values. You can see my resolution is only 960 by 540. So if I just move my render view down for now, I need to access my ambient occlusion material. I could go back to the hypershade, but I'll show you one other way. If I select any object in my scene, and we can select anyone because they've all got the same material, and if I now have a look in my attribute editor, you'll see we have that AO1 tab, and that is just our surface shader. We need to access the ambient occlusion. And if you look next to the name here, you've got two icons, and the top one is actually your input connection. If I click on that, it goes straight to the ambient occlusion material, and that's where we can adjust our samples. So if I try, and it's best to double the figure, so 16, 32, 64, 128 and so on. If I try maybe a 64, press enter, and if I go back to my render view, I'll just expand this, and I'm just going to render one section so you can see a comparison. So I'll just render this section here, and it will take a lot longer to render depending on the speed of your processor and how much RAM you have. Okay, so here already you can see it's much smoother. Even looking at the floor, we've got much less grain, and it appears slightly sharper. So what we could do now is perhaps increase our render resolution and render this in perhaps HD. So click on Options in your render view, Render Settings, And I'm not going to go and change the quality yet, I just want to increase the resolution. So in the common tab, scroll down, and if we go to presets, I might as well go all the way and go for HD 1080 now. Now I know I've got some of my settings right. I can increase my render view, and I'll render the whole frame now with the samples at 64 to see how that looks. And again, this might take a while to render, so do be patient with your machine. Keep saving in between renders if you make a lot of adjustments, and screenshot some of the adjustments you make just so you can see if anything goes wrong. Okay, so now that's done, you might find when you're rendering in a very high resolution, I don't know if you can see this in the screen recording, but it says my zoom is on 0.806. Now sometimes if it's not on 1, your render can look a little bit blurry, and this does at the moment on my screen. What I can do though is just go up to view in my render view and then click on real size. Now that says zoom 1.0. Now that to me looks sharp. I've got a bit of grain, but a bit of grain isn't a bad thing. If I try increasing that again, it's just going to dramatically increase my render time. Now I had to pause the video while it was rendering because it took 4 minutes and 8 seconds. Now that's quite a high spec computer on something that's not that high poly. This only has about 130,000 edges. So experiment with your sample rate. A general guide, something around 32 or 64 is good. If you go any higher, it will take a lot longer to render, so just bear that in mind. Keep your resolution small until you're happy, then go big and do one last render, but keep saving your scene as you go. Okay, so hopefully that will be of some use to you. Keep learning new things, keep practicing, and then look out for my next tutorials.